I do not remember the moment my heart stopped beating the first time, because the end of my first life was a blur of pain and fading light, a quiet crash of sensation that dissolved into an endless dark that felt like sleep without dreams, like sinking through deep water without ever reaching the bottom. And I had thought that would be my eternity, a stillness without breath, without body, without time. But eventually the darkness loosened its grip, and what pulled me back was not a heartbeat or a breath, but the faint memory of her face, the way she looked at me on the day I died, as if she wanted to hold on to my life even as it slipped away from me, and that memory rose inside the darkness like a small fragile flame, guiding me upward through centuries of silence until I felt myself forming again, piece by piece, thought by thought, sorrow by sorrow. When my eyes opened, I lay inside stone, sealed away from the world in a deep chamber older than the towns and forests above it, a place meant to keep the dead safe or forgotten. I could not tell which, but I understood quickly that I had been placed there by vampire hands because the air carried the scent of old magic, cold and thick, and I could feel the weight of ancient protection spells carved into the walls around me, symbols meant to preserve or contain something dangerous, something sacred, something broken. And as my senses sharpened, I realized with a strange calm that I had been dead for a very long time, long enough for the world to change, long enough for the memory of my name to drift into dust, long enough for everyone I once knew to be gone, except the one I had died for. My body felt heavier than stone as I pushed against the lid of the tomb, rising slowly, my movements stiff and silent. And when the stone slid aside, cold air rushed into my lungs even though I no longer needed air, and I staggered to my feet with the unsteady grace of someone learning how to exist again. My skin felt strange, my senses sharper than I remembered, and when I touched my chest, I found a long scar where the blade had passed through me centuries ago, a pale reminder of the night I chose to give my life to save hers. The chamber around me was lit only by a faint silver glow, perhaps moonlight touching the stone through cracks above, and I felt the world stirring around me, the deep, slow heartbeat of the earth, the faint tremble of distant footfalls, the quiet whisper of time. I recognized none of it. This was not the world I had known. This was a world built long after my death. But in my mind, she remained exactly as she was. The human woman whose life had been entwined with mine in ways neither of us expected. The one whose heartbeat I had memorized. The one whose laughter had softened centuries of hunger and pain. The one I had protected with every last drop of strength I possessed until my death took me from her arms. And even though I had risen into a world where everything was changed, I felt her memory like a quiet warmth beneath my ribs, and that memory guided my first step into the darkness beyond my tomb. I climbed through tunnels carved by ancient hands, feeling the weight of earth shift above me, and when I finally emerged through a crack in the stone into the night air, the sky spread above me in unfamiliar patterns, stars arranged in places I did not remember, constellations shifted by centuries of slow movement, and I knew then that I had slept through ages of history, long enough for the world to forget the battles I fought, the sacrifices I made, the love I carried in my chest like a quiet burning flame. The land around me was foreign too, covered in forests that had grown over ruins I once knew, the wind carrying scents of flowers that had replaced the old ones from my time, and the night felt lighter than I remembered, as if the weight of centuries had thinned its darkness. But the one thing that had not changed was the pull inside me, the soft, steady tug that led me north, toward her, toward a place where a human life should have ended long ago, but something deep inside me insisted she still existed, as impossible as that was. As I walked, my senses extended with each slow step, reaching outward through the night, tasting the air, reading the vibrations of the world, trying to understand how much had changed while I slept. I felt the presence of new vampire bloodlines roaming through distant forests, strange scents of creatures that had been born long after my death, and the quiet hum of human cities that glowed faintly in the far distance like clusters of stars fallen to earth. Yet beneath all of those new sounds and movements, I sensed something familiar. A heartbeat that felt like the echo of a memory, something soft, something warm, something human, something I had loved enough to die for. And even though I knew it was impossible, even though humans did not live for centuries, even though memory could not create truth, I followed that faint pull through forests and hills, through ruins and paths that no longer had names, until I reached a small town built of white stone and quiet streets, a place untouched by vampire rule and hidden from immortal conflicts, a peaceful place where no one knew what slept beneath ancient earth. And I felt her there, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a living presence, a living heartbeat, a living warmth that moved through the town like sunlight passing across water. When I stepped into the town, I did not expect her to still exist. I expected the heartbeat I felt to belong to some distant descendant, some echo in bloodline or spirit. But when I saw her for the first time after centuries of death, standing beneath the morning light, with hair the same colour as the woman I once loved, with eyes that held the same softness and the same steadiness, my body froze in place, and for the first time since rising from my tomb, I felt the sharp, painful throb of something close to breath hitching in my chest. She was alive. Alive in a world where she should have turned to dust centuries ago, alive with a heartbeat as steady and human as it had been the day I died, alive with a face unchanged by time. And yet she did not know me. Her eyes passed over me without recognition, without memory, without the faintest sign of the love we once shared, and I understood in that aching moment that some ancient magic had returned her to the world, reborn her body or preserved her life, but stripped away every memory of the vampire who had died for her. My feet remained rooted to the ground as she walked past me, alive and unaware, carrying flowers in her hands as if centuries had not passed, as if she had never watched me die, as if my sacrifice had vanished like smoke in the wind. And even though my heart no longer beat, I felt a pressure inside my chest that hurt more than any blade ever could, because I realized that I had risen for her, returned from death for her, and yet I could not reach toward her, could not speak her name, could not remind her of the centuries we had been torn apart. Because she was human, she was living a new life, a life untouched by vampire grief, a life without the sorrow of my death, and I knew in my quiet, heavy soul that reminding her would only break her again. It would tear open wounds she no longer remembered. It would steal from her the peace she had somehow regained. So I kept my distance. I followed her not with hunger or desperation, but with quiet devotion, moving through shadows and keeping her safe from dangers she did not know existed in the dark corners of her world. I watched her laugh with neighbours, tend to the garden outside her small home, and walk through the forest paths where night creatures sometimes stirred with hungry eyes. I walked behind her silently, guarding her as I had in life before, guarding her as I had promised the moment I died. Days passed, weeks passed, and then, with the same soft cruelty that fate had shown me before, time took her again, not in fire or violence or magic, but in the simple way humans leave the world, quietly, gently, fading like a candle at the end of its wick. I stood at her grave on the day the earth covered her body, the way she once stood over mine when I fell in battle to save her, and I understood then that my eternity was not tied to love returned, or memories shared, or a bond recognized. My eternity was tied to her existence, no matter the form it took. So I remained beside her grave long after the mourners left, long after the flowers wilted, long after the headstone weathered beneath centuries of rain. I stood where she once lived and once laughed, where she once looked at me with love I still remembered, even if she no longer did. I remained her guardian not in life, not in memory, but in devotion older than death itself. And even now, as seasons turn and the world changes again and again, I stand at her grave each night, the same way I once stood at her side, knowing she no longer remembers me, knowing she no longer knows the love we shared, knowing that her memory ended long before my devotion ever could. Because this is what eternal love means to a vampire who died for a human he could never forget. It is not shared happiness. It is not a promise returned. It is not a bond spoken aloud. It is simply this. I forgot to die properly. She forgot to remember me. And I will stand here forever, guarding the grave of the woman I loved, even though she never knew my name again. I do not know how many years passed after her burial, because time loses its meaning when one chooses to stand in the same place every night, unmoving beneath moonlight, guarding a grave that no longer holds breath, only silence. Seasons folded into one another like pages that could no longer be separated. Winters pressed frost against her headstone. Summers wrapped her resting place in warm, heavy air. Autumn leaves drifted around my feet in slow spirals. Spring flowers burst through the soil no matter how many times grief tried to strangle life from the earth. And through all of it, I stood beside her without a word or a thought that mattered, because my existence after death had narrowed to one purpose: protect what remained of her, protect the place where she had ended, protect the memory of a life she no longer remembered at all. I believed that would be my eternity. A vampire returned from death to watch over a grave that held the woman he loved more than his own life. A woman who had once spoken my name with warmth but had died centuries later without even knowing I existed. I accepted that fate, embraced it with the same quiet devotion that had defined my second life. And each night I listened to the soft shifting of the earth, the gentle hum of insects, the faint, distant sounds of a human world moving forward without me. Yet even eternity changes. Even death can shift. Even loss can stir. It began with a whisper in the soil beneath her grave. So faint, so fragile, so unfamiliar that I first believed it to be nothing more than the movement of a worm or the stirring of a root through the ground. But the whisper grew, soft at first, then steady, then rhythmic, like something breathing from beneath the earth, something that did not belong to decay or silence or the long sleep of death. And the moment I sensed that rhythm, I felt a cold shock move through my body, a sensation sharper than any wound I had taken in war. It felt like a heartbeat, a human heartbeat, a heartbeat that pulsed with her cadence. My fingers tightened against the edge of her headstone as I leaned closer, not daring to hope, not daring to imagine a miracle where only silence should exist. But the heartbeat continued, slow, soft, distant, like the echo of a memory finding a path back into the world, and when I closed my eyes, I felt the shape of that heartbeat through soil and stone and centuries of longing, and I recognized it with a certainty that wrapped around my soul like a forgotten hand reaching through the dark. It was her. Not her body, which had long since faded into the earth, not her breath, which had been lost to time, but something deeper, her essence, her soul, her spark, the faint trail of who she had once been. The earth beneath her grave rippled with soft, ancient magic, and I understood then that whatever force had returned me from death had also touched her, though not in the same way. Where I had risen in flesh, she now rose in spirit. Where I had regained form, she now found form in a different way. She had not returned to her old life, nor to the body that had once held her, but to something new, a life reborn somewhere far from the grave I had guarded for so long. And when that realization pierced through the stillness, something unfurled inside my chest, something like hope, sharp and aching, and almost unbearably bright. Then, as if fate wished to prove the truth beyond doubt, I felt a pull, not from the earth, not from blood, not from memory, but from the same ancient force that had resurrected me centuries ago. A thread of energy extended outward from her resting place, thin and fragile but real, reaching across the world toward the place where her soul now lived again, and that thread wound itself around my heart with delicate certainty, guiding me, calling me, asking me to follow. I had thought her story ended. I had thought mine ended beside her. But the world had shifted, making room for something new. And so I left her grave for the first time in decades. I walked through towns that had grown and fallen and been built again, listening to the sounds of human life moving in circles of birth and loss and renewal. The thread of her soul tugged me through forests where moonlight hung on the leaves like silver dust, across rivers that carried the scent of stone and rain, over mountains where cold winds bit against my skin but could not slow my steps. And as I moved through the world, the pull grew stronger, warmer, leading me toward a place where life stirred with familiarity so profound it took all my strength to remain steady. When I reached a quiet hillside village that smelled of fresh bread and morning wood smoke, I felt her presence so close that my knees almost weakened. Humans walked along the road, children played beneath low stone walls, elders carried baskets of herbs, and the soft hum of daily life wrapped around the street like a gentle song. But none of those things moved my soul. Only one thing did. The heartbeat that echoed faintly from the center of the village, a heartbeat that matched the rhythm I had felt beneath her grave. I followed the sound through narrow paths until I reached a small home with a garden full of soft white flowers, their petals glowing faintly in the morning light. And there she was, sitting by the window with her hair loose over her shoulders, her face turned toward the sun, her eyes bright and calm, unaware of the centuries that had shaped the soul inside her, unaware that she had been born before, lived before, loved before, died before. She breathed like a normal human. She moved like a normal human. She carried no memory of her past life. She did not know she had died once. She did not know that she had once taken her last breath with my name against her lips. She did not know that I had stood vigil over her grave for a lifetime. She did not know me. She did not know what she had been. She did not know what she had meant to me. And yet she existed, alive again, given a second life, without the weight of the first. And I felt something inside me break with soft, silent joy, the kind that comes from a wound opening so gently that it aches without bleeding. I stood hidden among the shadows of her garden, watching her lift a flower from the soil and smile at it with the same small tenderness she once used to show toward me in a different world, a different century, a different life. Her smile was unchanged, her spirit was unchanged, her gentleness was unchanged. Only her memories were gone. Only the part of her that remembered me had faded. I could have stepped forward. I could have spoken her name. I could have told her everything, but I would not. Because this life was hers, not mine, because she had been given peace, and I would not steal that from her. Because love, true love, does not demand recognition, it simply remains. So I stayed hidden as the sun moved across the sky, watching her live her life with the same quiet devotion I had carried through death. And when night fell, I climbed to the hill above her village and stood beneath the stars, listening to her soft heartbeat echo through the night. And in that quiet darkness, I understood my purpose once more, not to be remembered, not to be loved again, not to reclaim what I once lost, but to guard her, protect her, watch over her reborn soul as gently as a shadow, as quietly as time, as eternally as a vampire's devotion can be. And I knew then, with calm certainty, that I would follow her through every lifetime she was given, because even if she forgot me every time, I would remember enough for us both. In the days that followed her rebirth, I watched her from the edges of her world, always careful to remain nothing more than a shadow behind sunlight, a quiet presence in the spaces where no human eyes ever lingered. And bit by bit, I learned the rhythm of her new life, the places she walked, the small home she slept in, the garden she tended with soft hands that held the same gentle patience they had held in life before. Even though she did not know me, even though she had no memory of what she once meant to me, I felt no bitterness, only a deep and aching gratitude that she lived again, and that her soul had found peace in a life untouched by fear or pain. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks slid into years, I understood something quiet and startling. This life of hers would end too. She was human, she was mortal, she was fragile, and while her soul had returned to the world, her body would not remain forever. Time, soft and steady, would take her again, as it takes all humans, even the ones returned by ancient magic. And when that day arrived, when age or sickness pulled her away from the world once more, I would stand by her grave again. It would be a cycle I would live through endlessly, a rhythm of love and loss, rebirth and death, a pattern carved into the eternal existence of a vampire who had already lived through centuries of silence. I learned to accept it even before it happened. I told myself I would bear it gently. But acceptance does not soften grief. Acceptance only prepares a place for it to sit. And so, when her first reborn life came to its quiet end, years later, beneath a blanket of morning fog that clung to the village like a soft veil, I felt the familiar ache inside my chest, the ache that had once torn me apart the night she died in my arms centuries ago. But this time, I did not kneel by her side or hold her hand. I did not allow myself such mercy. I stood far away in the shadows beside the grove of tall trees and watched the small procession of humans carry her body to the hill behind the village. They buried her with flowers, simple white blooms she had grown herself, and the earth accepted her as gently as it had the first time. I let the villagers leave. I let the night rise. And when the world emptied of all human noise, I approached her grave, my steps soft on the grass, my hands trembling in a way they had not done since my first life. And I stood there in silence, the way I had before, the way I always would, letting centuries fold around me like a cloak of shadow. I watched the sky turn from night to dawn, and in the soft light of early morning, I made the same vow I had made in the century before. I would stay until she returned again, because she always returned, because her soul was not done with the world, because some force, old as stone, soft as breath, kept pulling her back into life. And like a tide drawn by a distant moon, I followed. Years passed. Decades passed. The village changed, new houses rising where old ones fell, roads bending in new directions, the world shifting like a restless dream. But each time her soul re-entered the world, I felt it. The pull, the heartbeat, the warmth. And I would travel across forests, cities, oceans, whatever the world had become, to stand at the place where she was born again. Her second reborn life was short, like a candle that burned too quickly. She was only a small child when I found her, her spirit bright and soft like the first light of dawn. She would run through fields with bare feet, picking flowers to place in the hair of her mother. And even though she had no memory of me, I felt her soul recognize something in the air around her whenever I watched her from afar. She would look toward the shadows and stare for a long moment, her small face full of wonder, as if she sensed something familiar there, an echo, a presence, a whisper of a love that once held her through death. But that life ended too soon, taken not by age but by the simple cruelty of human fragility. A fever swept through her village, and her small body could not fight it. She left the world without ever knowing the centuries she carried inside her spirit, without ever knowing the vampire who watched her from the trees beyond her window. And when she was buried, I felt the ache rise in me again, heavy and deep, a reminder that even the immortal heart can break in quiet, endless ways. Her third rebirth came not long after, a young woman with dark hair and a gentle voice, living in a coastal town where waves crashed against rocks and gulls cried overhead. She was older this time, steady and calm, working at a small wooden pier that smelled of salt and sunlight. I watched her repair fishing nets with delicate hands, laugh with townspeople, feed stray cats that curled around her legs with soft mews. And once again she carried the same softness, the same patience, the same quiet joy that had made me love her centuries ago. But what struck me most about that life was the moment she stood on the pier at sunset, staring at the glowing horizon with a sadness she could not explain. I felt the ache of it, even from the shadows. It was a sorrow she carried without memory, a sorrow deep in her soul, the shape of something she had lost long ago but could not name. She would place a hand over her heart, as if something inside her ached in ways she did not understand. And I knew she felt the echoes of the life she once lived with me, even if she could not remember my face, my voice, or the way I once held her as she took her final breath. She died in that life as well, older this time, quietly, gently, in a bed surrounded by people who cared for her. I watched from the doorway of her home, hidden by moonlight, as she slipped from the world with the same calm grace she held in life. And when they buried her again, I stood on the hill above the sea and listened to the waves crash over and over, the sound like an ancient heartbeat reminding me that eternity is made of loss and returning. Her fourth rebirth happened in a city filled with tall buildings and glowing lights that shaped the sky into a shimmering maze. She was a student then, carrying books and papers through crowded streets, her hair tied back, her eyes bright with curiosity. She walked fast, lived fast, breathed fast, as if the world was too small to contain the energy moving through her veins. I followed her through busy marketplaces, watched her read beneath the dim light of a cafe, observed her kindness towards strangers and her quiet moments of exhaustion when she sat alone on park benches with her head bowed, unaware of the vampire watching her from the shadows of the tallest trees. In that life, she lived long and full, but not without hardship. She lost friends, she lost family, she lost dreams. And each time something weighed on her heart, she would look upward toward the sky with a strange longing, as if searching for something she could not see. And even though she did not remember me, she would sometimes walk through the old cemetery at the edge of the city, stopping at graves without names, touching the stones with gentle fingers, as if honoring something her soul could feel, but her mind could not recall. When she died in that life, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines and the soft glow of artificial light, I stood outside the window of her room as the monitor flattened into silence. I felt the thread of her soul slip from her body with the same soft whisper that had guided me centuries ago. And I bowed my head, not in grief alone, but in gratitude, because she had lived a life full of purpose, full of warmth, full of moments that shaped her soul in ways even reincarnation could not erase. And then she returned again, each life different, each life new, each life shaped by choices that were hers alone. I followed her through every lifetime, always watching from a distance, always protecting her when danger whispered too close, always guiding shadows away from her path, always stepping into the darkness whenever the world threatened her. She never saw me. She never remembered me. But her soul sometimes paused in my direction with a kind of unspoken recognition, like a dream she could almost recall but not quite touch. And with every rebirth, I loved her quietly, patiently, eternally. Not because she had once loved me, not because she ever would again, but because love does not fade when its story ends. It simply moves through the world in different forms, waiting for the soul that once made it whole. And even though I knew she would continue to return without memory, and even though I knew I would watch her die 1,000 times if the world demanded it from me, there was one truth that carried me through every century, every loss, every moment spent in the shadows. I would follow her through every lifetime she was given. I would guard her soul across every rebirth. I would love her in silence, even if she never spoke my name again. Because I was a vampire who died for her once, and eternity, for me, was simply the space between her lives. There comes a point in eternity when repetition begins to feel like ritual, and ritual begins to feel like breath, something automatic, something steady, something rooted too deeply to ever be separated from the soul. That is what following her had become for me, an unbroken ritual, a quiet breath stretched across lifetimes, the soft movement of devotion that shaped centuries into a single, continuous moment. I no longer marked time by years or seasons or the rise and fall of kingdoms. I marked it only by her rebirths, by the first flicker of her soul returning to the world, by the first heartbeat that echoed through me like a song I had waited lifetimes to hear. Her next rebirth came during a storm that shook the earth so violently I felt the tremor even from a distant land. I was crossing the mountains that separated two human territories when the thunder cracked open the sky with a roar that felt unnaturally alive, and in that noise I sensed something deeper. A pulse of light, a shift in the air, a quiet awakening beneath the sound of rain. It was her soul returning, her breath beginning again. Her life unfolding in a world that no longer remembered the centuries she had lived before. I followed the storm's path through forests drowned in rain, through fields washed in silver light, toward a small village where candles flickered in windows and humans huddled inside their warm homes to escape the thunder. The pull of her soul drew me toward a modest house on a hill where the wind slammed against wooden walls and the night pressed heavily through every crack. And inside that house, she entered the world with a soft cry that carried the tone of a memory, the sound of a reborn soul stretching into new flesh. I watched through the shadowed corner of the room, unseen, unnoticed, as the midwife wrapped her in a blanket and placed her in her mother's arms. She was so small again, fragile and new, carrying none of the faces she once had, none of the features I remembered, and yet her soul shone with the same warm glow I had followed through centuries. There was no mistaking her. She was here again, alive again, beginning again. My immortal heart ached with something I did not have a name for anymore. Joy twisted with grief, love tangled with loss, longing wrapped in quiet acceptance. I knew this pattern, knew this fragile beginning, knew this small spark of life would one day fade again. But I also knew I would follow her through every moment she was allowed. I would guard her as she grew. I would hold back danger with the same ancient strength I had carried through my own death. Her childhood in this life was softer than the ones before. She was calm, thoughtful, a quiet child who preferred the company of books and fields over crowds and games. She walked alone through the tall grass with a peaceful expression, stopping often to pick flowers or watch insects climb the blades of green. She lived as if the world whispered to her in ways she could not understand, as if the edges of reality held meaning she could almost touch, but not quite grasp. Sometimes, when she sat beneath the shade of a tree with sunlight filtering through the leaves, she would look toward the shadows behind her with a soft, puzzled expression, as if she sensed something there, something familiar, something gentle. And for the first time in all her reborn lives, I realized she was beginning to feel me. It was not recognition, it was not a memory, it was something deeper, something older, something instinctive, an awareness of a presence that had followed her through centuries. At night, When she lay in her bed listening to the rain, she would sometimes place a hand over her heart with a thoughtful frown, as if something inside her stirred with ancient emotion she could not name. And when I watched from the window, standing silent beneath the dripping branches of an old tree, she would turn her head toward me, always toward me, her eyes lingering on the darkness outside as if searching for something she felt but could not see. And then, one night, something changed. She was older then, no longer a child, standing at the threshold of adulthood with a softness that had grown sharper around the edges. She had lived long enough to form a mind filled with wonder, but not long enough to bury the instinctive truths her soul carried from the lives before. She walked through the fields with slow steps, the moon glowing above her like a pale lantern, and she stopped in a place where the air felt unusually still. It was the hill overlooking her village, the place where she always seemed to pause, the place where something inside her always grew quiet. I followed her there as I always did, my footsteps soundless on the damp earth, staying far enough behind that she would not see me, close enough that her soul might feel me. She reached the top of the hill and stood with her arms folded gently, watching the village lights flicker below like tiny stars pressed into the ground. And as the wind brushed her hair, she closed her eyes with an expression I had never seen on her before, a look of distant recognition, the beginning of memory, the spark of something old resurfacing in her new life. She lifted a hand then, placing it gently over her heart, and I felt something pull inside me so sharply it almost drove me to my knees. For she whispered a name within her soul, not aloud, not fully formed, not a true memory, just a feeling, a shape, a shadow of something lost, and that name, unspoken, unfinished but powerful, was mine. I stood frozen in the darkness, the world narrowing around me, as if every star in the sky had turned to watch this single moment. My heartbeat did not exist, but something inside me trembled with the force of what she had nearly remembered. The memories she once carried, the night she held me as I died, the centuries of love before that, the touch of my hand on her cheek, the warmth of her breath on my skin, had not returned. But the shape of me had, the echo of me had. The outline of a life long gone had stirred inside her. And then, as gently as a leaf falling to the ground, she lowered her hand and opened her eyes, unaware of the nearly unbearable truth she had brushed against. Her soul remembered me, even if her mind did not. That night marked the first shift in centuries, the first crack in the silence, the first tremble in the wall of forgetfulness that had separated us through life after life. She continued to sense me in the days that followed, small moments at first, turning her head when I walked behind her in the woods, pausing when I stepped close enough that her spirit brushed against mine, shivering gently when I stood guard outside her home while she slept. Each time, she would stare into the darkness as if searching for someone she had met in a dream, and gradually she began to change. She grew quieter, drifting through her days with a distant look, as if listening for a voice she could not recall. She touched her chest more often, placing her hand over her heart as though trying to calm a feeling she did not understand. She walked with a small ache in her eyes, like someone mourning something she could not name. It was the first time she had carried a sorrow for me while she still lived. I should have felt joy, but all I felt was fear. Fear that some part of her would remember the pain of my death. Fear that her soul might carry a grief she was never meant to bear in this new life. I had vowed to never force her into memories she had not chosen. I had vowed to protect her peace even if it meant being forgotten forever. But the world does not bend to vows easily, and souls do not forget what shaped them. Love, once lived deeply enough, leaves a scar across eternity. She began to walk the world as if searching for someone she had loved so completely that even death and rebirth could not erase the echo of him. And I knew then that the time was coming when she would see me again, not as a stranger, not as a shadow, but as a memory returning. Whether that meeting would heal her or break her, I could not know. I only knew this. A lifetime was approaching where she would finally remember me. And I feared that moment more than I feared the centuries without her. There are moments in eternity when the world becomes so still that it feels as though even time itself is holding its breath, and in the lifetime that followed her trembling recognition on the hill, I sensed that stillness growing around her like a soft, invisible cage. She moved more slowly after that night, walking through her days as though she were listening to something only she could hear, as though each step carried the weight of a memory she could not fully grasp. Her hands often lingered against her chest, her eyes softened with that distant ache, and every so often she would pause in the middle of a quiet room, her breath catching in her throat as though she had just brushed against a truth too heavy to hold. I stayed close to her in that life, closer than I had dared in any lifetime before, because something inside my immortal soul whispered that her memory would return fully soon. Not in sudden clarity, not in overwhelming revelation, but in the deep, soft way that light slowly fills a room in the earliest moments of dawn. Her soul carried the shape of me now, a shape she had begun to trace in the darkness, and I knew that with each passing day, she was stitching together fragments from the life we once shared, pieces buried beneath centuries of rebirth. As her understanding grew, she became quieter, not withdrawn, not frightened, but contemplative, like someone carrying a private longing. She wandered more frequently to the hill where she had first felt me, always at dusk when the sun sank low and the shadows stretched long. She would sit in the grass with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sky shift into shades of pink and violet, and I would stand behind her in the shade of the old tree, feeling her soul pulse toward mine with a gentle ache. And then, one night, she placed both hands over her heart and bowed her head with a trembling breath, and her soul pulled toward me with such force that I felt it like a shock through every part of my body. It was not recognition, not yet, but it was longing, deep, ancient longing, a need to understand what her heart already knew. I stepped closer that night, closer than I had ever dared in all her lifetimes, close enough that the air between us thinned, close enough that her breath faltered, close enough that her soul reached out to mine like a hand stretching through the dark. She did not see me with her eyes, but she felt me in her essence, and she rose to her feet with slow, shaking movement, turning toward the shadows with her brow furrowed in aching confusion. She took one step closer, and I took one step back. Not because I feared her, but because I feared what memory would do to her living heart. Humans were fragile. Their hearts were not meant to carry centuries, not meant to carry the weight of death and love and sacrifice that spanned more than one life. Her soul called to me again the next night, each time stronger, each time sharper, each time closer to truth, and eventually the truth became too heavy for her to carry alone. She fell ill in that lifetime, not with sickness of the body but with the quiet, unbearable pressure of a soul trying to open a door her mind could not unlock. She grew pale. She grew weary. Her nights became restless, filled with dreams that left her breathless upon waking. Dreams of shadows, dreams of cold hands warming hers, dreams of blood and sacrifice and a face she could almost, but not quite, remember. I watched as she grew weaker, her steps slowing, her shoulders sinking beneath invisible weight. Her loved ones thought she was tired. They thought her heart was fragile. They thought her mind was burdened by ordinary worries. But I knew better. I knew that the centuries were beginning to press through her skin, through her bones, through the fragile boundary of her human life. And then, late one night, as the wind swept through the village with a cold whisper, she left her home with trembling legs and climbed the hill one last time. I followed her closely, nearly close enough for her to hear the stillness of my breathless presence, because something in the way she moved told me this would be the night her soul remembered everything. She reached the top of the hill and stood beneath the branches of the old tree where I always watched her. She placed one hand on the rough bark, closing her eyes as she leaned her forehead against the trunk, and I felt the pull inside her become a tidal wave, strong enough to bend eternity, strong enough to tear through the layers of her reincarnation, strong enough to shatter the fragile line between her past life and her present one. Her memories rose slowly at first, soft and trembling like the first lights of dawn. She remembered a touch, mine. She remembered a voice, mine. She remembered a night filled with blood and cold and heartbreak, mine. She remembered holding a dying vampire in her arms. She remembered the weight of my body as it collapsed against hers. She remembered the warmth of her tears on my lifeless skin. She remembered loving me so deeply that death could not unbind us. The memories struck her like a quiet storm, filling her chest with pain so sharp she fell to her knees in the grass, her palms pressed to the earth as if trying to steady the world beneath her. Her breath came in quick, uneven bursts. Her shoulders trembled with the force of seeing centuries in a single instant, and her heart, her fragile human heart, strained beneath the weight of emotions meant for immortal souls. I stepped out of the shadows then, unable to remain hidden any longer, unable to let her break alone. For the first time in all her lifetimes, I let her see me, not as a presence, not as a shadow, but as the vampire she had once loved, the one who died for her, the one who had followed her through centuries of rebirth. She lifted her head, her eyes wide, her breath stolen from her lungs, and in that moment, beautiful and terrible, she remembered me fully, not in pieces, not in echoes, but completely. All the love, all the grief, all the centuries, all the death, all the devotion. Her memories returned like a flood, overwhelming her spirit, overwhelming her human form, overwhelming a heart too soft to hold eternity. And then, as her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it mirrored my own, I understood what I had feared from the beginning. Recognition would kill her. Her heart began to fail, not from illness, not from age, but from the unbearable weight of remembering a love that stretched beyond the limits of mortal flesh. She reached toward me with a trembling hand, not in plea, not in fear, but in aching understanding, and I felt my own immortal soul fracture as I knelt before her, unable to save her from the truth she had finally reclaimed. She pressed her forehead to mine in her last breath, just as she had in her first death, her soul touching mine with a warmth that broke me open, and in that final heartbeat before her body fell still, she remembered everything we had once been. And then she was gone, her body quiet. Her breath ended. Her soul slipped from her form with a final, gentle whisper. I caught her before she collapsed to the earth, lowering her silently into the grass beneath the tree where she had remembered me. The moon shone on her face, soft and serene, her expression peaceful in the way only truth can bring. And I held her the way she once held me centuries ago, letting eternity fold around us in a quiet circle of love and loss. She died remembering me, remembering us, remembering everything. And though it shattered me, it was the most beautiful end she could have. I buried her on that same hill, beneath the old tree whose roots had known our presence for centuries, and I placed stones around her grave in the same pattern she once used to mark places sacred to her. I stood there long after dawn broke, long after the world awakened, long after the weight inside my chest pulled me into silence deeper than any I had ever known. I do not know when she will return again. I do not know what form she will take. I do not know if she will remember me in the next life or forget me entirely. But I will wait, as I always have, as I always will, because eternity is only unbearable when walking alone, and I have never walked alone. I have walked with her soul beside me, through death and rebirth, through memory and forgetting, and I will walk with her again, even if she never remembers me, even if she only sees me for a single heartbeat in each lifetime, because that one heartbeat is worth all of eternity. If the soul you loved across centuries finally remembered you only at the end, would you hold on to the pain of that moment or follow her into the next life to begin again? Like, comment, and subscribe for the next gem.